This is a review session for Unit 4, Jesus the Messiah and Son of God. We'll be going through all of the review questions that are on the unit review sheet. Question 1. What is the Messianic secret? The Messianic secret is the fact that Jesus tried to keep his identity as the Messiah a secret. He tried to avoid being directly and publicly identified as the Messiah. He certainly thought of himself as the Messiah, but he didn't want that said out loud, and we call that the Messianic secret. What sorts of things did Jesus do to try to avoid being identified as the Messiah? Well, first and foremost, whenever the demons would cry out his name and try to identify him, he would silence them. Whenever he healed someone, he would make sure that he would instruct them, don't tell anyone. He even when people tried to go tell, he would instruct them to keep quiet. Whenever he talked about himself, he never called himself the Son of God or the Messiah. He always called himself the Son of Man, which, as we'll see in a subsequent question, is this very ambiguous term. It's not quite clear for most of his ministry what it means or what he means by it. Does he mean that he's the Messiah, or is he just using it sort of in a humble sense of I'm just a mere human? When Peter identifies him as the Messiah, says, "Lord, you are the Messiah," Jesus immediately tells him not to tell anyone. Right? And there is a point in Jesus' ministry where he goes up the mountain with several of his disciples, and he's transfigured in front of them. He's robed in dazzling white, and he's standing there suddenly between Moses and Elijah, who represent the law and the prophets, very clearly being presented as the Messiah to them. A voice comes from the cloud, "This is my son, listen to him." On the way back down the mountain, Jesus warns his disciples not to tell anyone. Question 3. What signs did Jesus give that he was in fact the Messiah? First thing that he did is he compared himself to David, who of course was the model for the Messiah, the original anointed one of God. When Jesus and his disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath, the Pharisees confront them and say, "Well, why are you doing this?" And Jesus doesn't say, "Oh, it's only a little bit of grain," or "it's not really a violation." He takes a much bolder approach. He says, "Well, when David was escaping from Saul, he went and he ate the bread that only the priests could eat. Therefore, I can pick grain on the Sabbath." So essentially, he compares himself to David. He puts himself in that same role as the king, as the Messiah. Secondly, he points to John the Baptist as Elijah. It was widely believed that Elijah would return to herald the Messiah. So if John the Baptist was Elijah, the clear implication is that Jesus is the Messiah. He staged a royal procession into Jerusalem. This is where he arranges to ride a donkey into the city, and the people wave palm branches and call out, "Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna to our King," deliberately going out of his way to fulfill this prophecy from the prophet Zechariah about the Messiah coming to Jerusalem. So clearly he's putting himself again in that role as the Messiah. When a woman anoints him, pours oil, costly oil, over his head, and his disciples are quite upset because of the expense of the oil, Jesus doesn't chastise her, although he's constantly challenging people in his ministry to give away their wealth to the poor. In this instance, he praises this woman, and he says that what she does will always be remembered because she has anointed him. And recall that the word Messiah means anointed one. Jesus chooses 12 apostles, a very symbolic number. It's meant to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the things that the Messiah was expected to do was to reunite the nation, to bring back sort of the lost sheep of Israel, those people who had been scattered, the tribes that had been lost. And Jesus does this symbolically by picking 12 apostles to be his inner core group. Lastly, once he is on trial, when he's standing there before the high priest, he very openly identifies himself with the Son of Man of Daniel 7. You may recall in that passage in the prophet Daniel, Daniel's having a vision, and there are these 4 beasts that have sort of been terrorizing the earth, and they represent these different empires that have come and conquered Israel. And then he says, the Ancient One comes and sets up his throne. This is God coming, and judges the beasts and slays them. And then one like a son of man comes on the clouds of heaven, and he's given everlasting dominion and kingship and authority over the earth. Well, when Jesus is on trial and he's asked, "Are you the Messiah?" he quotes that passage from Daniel 7 about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And immediately the high priest recognizes he's claiming himself to be this Messiah, the one who is given kingship over the whole world. Why did Jesus try to keep his identity as the Messiah a secret? Well, you have to recall what the expectations were for the Messiah at that time, commonly among the Jews in the first century. Their expectation was that the Messiah would come and be a warrior like David, sort of arise out of their midst unexpectedly and lead them in battle against the nations that oppressed them, just as David led the Israelites against the Philistines, defeating Goliath and eventually freeing them from the Philistines. This Messiah would come and free them from their enemies, most likely the Romans who were ruling them at that time, and defeat them in battle quite decisively, to the point where other nations would have to come and recognize Israel as God's chosen people and bow down before their king. And the Messiah would take the throne, restoring David's dynasty and reigning from Jerusalem. Well, that wasn't really the vision that Jesus had for himself as Messiah. He did think of himself as the Messiah, but that wasn't what he was going to do. And given that that's what most people expected the Messiah to be, it wasn't really helpful for him to have people calling him the Messiah. All that did was put the wrong ideas in people's heads. So all the while he's trying to hint that he's the Messiah, show he's the Messiah, and yet he deliberately avoids that label because he knows it's just going to confuse most people. The term Son of Man, as we alluded to earlier, this term is a term that comes from the Old Testament. It's used many, many times in the Old Testament, primarily in the book of Ezekiel, but also some in the Psalms and once in the book of Daniel and in a few other places. In the book of Ezekiel, where it's used most often, it simply means mere human. God orders Ezekiel around, "Son of man, do this, son of man, do that." And it just means you, human being, you are literally the son of a man. So it's a real term of humility. You're sort of a lowly creature. However, when Daniel uses the term, it's that passage we alluded to before, where the Son of Man comes on the clouds of heaven and is given everlasting dominion and kingship over the earth. So Jesus uses this term, Son of Man, to refer to himself. As we said before, he doesn't call himself Son of God. He doesn't call himself Messiah. He always refers to himself as the Son of Man. And this helps him. It helps him preserve that messianic secret because no one's quite sure how he's using it. Is he using it in the Ezekiel sense, that I'm just a lowly human, a lowly prophet here serving God? Or does he mean it in the Daniel sense? I'm the one whom God is giving authority over the entire earth. I am the King, the everlasting King. Because people aren't sure what he means by it, it's a helpful term for him. It keeps them guessing, which is exactly kind of what Jesus wants, because he wants to help them redefine their expectations about the Messiah. What are two stories where we see Jesus specifically instruct people he has helped to spread the news about what he has done and who he is? Why does Jesus not need to be concerned about preserving the messianic secret in these two situations? All right, so we said before that Jesus is always trying to keep people quiet. Don't tell anybody that I healed you. Or when the demons try to identify him as the Messiah, he silences them. When Peter claims he's the Messiah, he tells them, don't tell anybody. But there are these two very curious stories where Jesus just basically comes right out with who he is. The first one is the story of the Gerasene demoniac. The story of the man who lives among the tombs and beats himself with rocks and shrieks and howls at nights. And it turns out that he has a whole legion of demons inside him, that when Jesus casts them out, enter a herd of 2,000 pigs who immediately drown themselves. It's a very, very bizarre and disturbing story. But after Jesus has healed the man comes to Jesus and wants to go with Jesus and follow him. And Jesus says, no, go tell your friends, go tell your neighbors, go tell your family all that I've done for you. It's hard to find another passage in the Bible where Jesus does this, where he goes and tells somebody to go and proclaim it, at least not until after his resurrection. But during Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus is always telling people not to tell. The difference here is that Jesus is in the land of the Gerasenes. The Gerasenes were not Jews. If they were Jews, they wouldn't have had a whole herd of pigs. And so Jesus doesn't need to be worried about sort of the messianic expectations of these people. They don't have messianic expectations, and so it's fine for this man to go tell about him. The second story is like it. Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, and he quite openly reveals the fact that he's the Messiah to her. She starts saying, well, I know you Jews believe in this Messiah who's going to come and somehow going to explain things. She's somewhat vague on what the Messiah will do. And Jesus says, I'm he, the one you're speaking to. I mean, he just comes right out and identifies himself as the Messiah. Again, he's not in Jewish territory. The people he's talking to in these instances aren't expecting the Messiah to be a warrior king who's going to lead them in battle. So he doesn't have to worry about them having these inaccurate expectations. Number 7, how do Jesus' disciples respond to each of his 3 predictions of his passion? What do their responses reveal about their understanding of his identity? Remember that once Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus goes out of his way on 3 separate occasions to warn his disciples, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die. And each time the disciples show how much they misunderstand him and just don't get this point that he's talking about. Immediately after he tells them the first time, Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. Basically says, no, Jesus, you're wrong. You're not going to die. You're not going to suffer. The second time Jesus does this, the disciples are quite confused. So they simply turn to arguing over which one of them is the greatest. Right? They're clearly not processing this message that he's going to suffer and die, and they may well have to also. They still think they're on a mission of triumph, of glory, and it matters which one of them is the greatest. The third time Jesus warns them of his coming suffering, 2 of Jesus' disciples come and request that they get to sit at Jesus' right and his left when he becomes king and reigns in Jerusalem. And the other disciples are upset because they've requested this. They all sort of want the seat of honor next to Jesus once he's finally reigning as king. Again, they're not listening to what Jesus is saying about his coming suffering. They still are convinced that he's going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to lead them in battle, he's going to become their king, and that potentially they could be sort of his court officials. So they're not hearing what Jesus is saying about his coming suffering. They still are fixated on this idea of the Messiah as the conqueror king. What idea was central to Jesus' own understanding of his vocation? In other words, if he wasn't going to fulfill the traditional expectations about the Messiah, what was he going to do? Well, as we've just alluded to, he firmly believes that he's going to suffer and die, and that somehow this suffering and dying is going to redeem his own people. We see him allude to that in so many different places in his ministry, this constant referencing that he's going to suffer and die. Where does he get this idea? Well, he gets it from the Old Testament. There are any number of places you can go to, but sort of the key passages are the series of poems or songs in the prophet Isaiah that we call the suffering servant songs, or sometimes simply the servant songs. And they're about this righteous, faithful servant of the Lord who, even though he's innocent, suffers, but somehow through his suffering redeems his people and sins are forgiven. We looked at some of those passages. The longest song is in Isaiah 52 to 53. But if you look in notes too, there's the references for the other ones. There were also some other passages in some of the other prophets that point to this idea of a figure who suffers somehow, but whose suffering is redemptive. Number 10, describe Jesus' actions and words that indicate that he was divine and understood himself to be divine. Remember here, this is a separate claim from being the Messiah. Just keep these categories straight in your head. Messiah means anointed king. You didn't have to be divine to be the Messiah. David was a Messiah. Solomon was a Messiah. They were awaiting this human figure from the line of David who would lead them in battle, become their king. This claim that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's divine, is a totally other claim. This is something that goes far beyond anything the Jews were expecting.